Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is great to see you all here. We have a full room here. I understand we have about 200 additional people who registered on Zoom, and this is being live streamed. So thank you all for participating and for joining us for this launch of our latest task force report, Securing Space, a Plan for U.S. Action. More than 60 years ago, with the launch of Sputnik 1, it created that so-called Sputnik moment where the U.S., then under John Kennedy, came together to say, we want to go to the moon in this decade. And we not only planted a flag on the moon before the end of that decade, but we took the steps necessary to make sure that the U.S. would be the world's preeminent space power. The task force starts by recognizing that the space domain that John F. Kennedy faced is much different than the one that we face today. Since that time, we now have 90 countries that are space powers, thanks in large part to the private sector that have accelerated innovation and opened the door for more governments to send assets into space, including satellites. Needless to say, space is becoming crowded, particularly low Earth orbit, LEO, where we have the proliferation not only of satellites, but of space junk, or I guess the more accurate term is space debris, which raises the risk of debris, hitting satellites and destroying a lot of those assets. There is something like 40,000 items in that low Earth orbit, all sharing that kind of space. And that means that collisions between the assets of China, Russia, the US, and others is ever more likely. At the same time, China and Russia have shown interest in expanding their anti-satellite capabilities, which if used would threaten US security and economic interests. Just to think about how much, not only is there more activity in space, but how much more dependent we are on space for our daily lives. Everything from driving cars and GPS systems to obviously our high-stake national security operations, allowing our military forces and our intelligence capabilities to talk to each other and to coordinate activity. So space is strategically vital for all of those reasons. And that's why the Council convened this task force to explore how best to close the governance gap around space, how to preserve the United States status as the leading space power, and how to ensure that space can be a peaceful and sustainable domain for all. This report is a culmination of nearly a year's worth of work, hard work and dedication from our co-chairs, our project director, task force members, and observers, as well as our staff here at CFR. And task forces are really one of the preeminent products of the Council. I have to say, I directed a task force a long time ago. I think probably 30 people read it. It had almost no impact on the broader, but it was an interesting process to go through. It was about economic development in the Balkans at the end of the 90s. This one promises to be much more significant, I believe, in both its timeliness, and its impact. Because to bring together a bipartisan group of task force members from across multiple domains, government, private sector, academia, think tanks, and the like, to reach consensus on both a number of observations, but also recommendations about US leadership in this domain and the benefits that come with it. I want to commend the task force for their commitment in forging this way forward. I want to thank the co-chairs, former Congresswoman Jane Harman and retired Lieutenant General Nina Armagno. I want to very much thank CFR's own Esther Brimmer, who directed the task force and held the pen on the report. Anya Schmemann, who shepherded the process and made sure there was discipline in everything that we did, as well as the task force team, Shelley Setzer and Kat Viella, for their support and management of the report. There are some task force members here in the room and some more on Zoom. I want to recognize Steve Hadley in particular, who may not remember it, but I think it was his idea in the first place for us to do a space task force. So he planted the seed and was good enough to serve on the task force and contribute in very significant ways. This is a whole of CFR effort, bringing together scholars, members, the broader community. It sort of represents in many ways the best of what CFR has to offer. And today we'll have two sessions for you, a session on the report's findings and recommendations with our co-chairs and a session on current policy challenges in space. In a moment, we'll go to a video that explains our task force, and then I'll turn it over to the first session's moderator, Nick Schifrin. Thank you.
In February 2024, NASA's TIME spacecraft, on a mission since 2001 to study the Earth's atmosphere, narrowly missed colliding with a dormant Russian satellite. The two crafts were just 30 feet apart, about the length of a school bus. NASA called the encounter shocking. Had the two assets collided, a storm of hypervelocity shrapnel would have spread hundreds of miles, tearing through everything in its path, endangering the lives of astronauts and wreaking havoc on the billions of dollars of technology humans rely on for daily life. This near hit is a chilling reminder that the rules of space have become far more complex. Since the days of the Apollo moon missions, the United States has enjoyed 70 years of dominance in space. We've come to depend on space-based technologies. These include everything from weather forecasts to GPS-powered apps like Google Maps, and perhaps most importantly, the internet, which has become an essential part of modern life. But in many ways, the United States has begun to lag behind its competitors, risking serious consequences. In the past 5 years alone, China has launched more than 500 objects into space and has also built its own orbiting space station and remains the only country to have placed not just one, but two landers on the far side of the moon. China is not alone in its acceleration. The number of countries with at least one object in space has doubled since 2010. Today, more than 90 nations together possess over 13,000 satellites, and those are just the active ones. Governments are no longer driving the technological advances in space. Private companies are now leading the way. With so many assets in space, space traffic management has become a looming challenge that must be solved. No single international organization governs space flight safety or dispute resolution, like the agencies that manage civil air traffic or international shipping. In fact, each country assigns its own orbital position before launch into low Earth orbit, and no international rules exist to resolve overlapping paths. This threat is compounded by the sheer amount of infrastructure already floating in space. Simply put, more stuff in space means more space junk, and more space junk means more chance for collision. Look no further than what happened when a small metal fragment, thinner than a human hair, hit a window on the International Space Station. If the station's windows weren't reinforced with silica, or the debris was just a bit bigger, it could have spelled disaster for the crew members' lives. Satellites are also essential to U.S. national security, enabling the United States to communicate with its military forces, gather intelligence, and even warn of a potential nuclear attack. Because the United States maintains more strategic assets in space than any other country, its space infrastructure is uniquely vulnerable. U.S. space assets are increasingly at risk from attacks by China, Russia, and other potential adversaries that could come from the ground, from the air, or from space itself. For instance, Russia is developing so-called direct ascent ASAT, or anti-satellite missiles, which would have the ability to destroy a satellite in space. Although current international treaties prohibit governments from placing nuclear weapons in space, U.S. adversaries have moved closer and closer to breaking international norms on Earth and in orbit. A lot is at stake. We must make space leadership a national priority and help set the agenda for international cooperation. Even potential adversaries will need to work together to ensure traffic safety in space, and the expertise and the perspective of the private sector will be critical to effective space traffic management. Our actions now will shape human activity in space for decades. Much like the high seas, space is beyond national jurisdiction. All countries must work together to maintain open access. The United States has long been a leader in space, It's time to make sure we don't fall behind.
Oh, let me just go change here.
Nope.
Okay. Whatever.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone here. Welcome, everyone online to today's first session on Securing Space, a plan for U.S. action, an event that we're going to introduce CFR's Task Force on Space Management Policy. You've already heard the primer a little bit, but I am thrilled to be able to have my esteemed guests here to go through the strategic environment that we're talking about and the solutions that they've written about in their report. I'm Nick Schifrin. I'm the Foreign Affairs correspondent for PBS NewsHour. And quickly, let me just mention who we have up here. I think we already know who all of them are, but Esther Brimmer, the James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance at CFR, and I'll mention, because this is going to come up, the former Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs. We're going to be talking about that quite a bit. Lieutenant General Nina Armango was the staff director of the U.S. Space Force from August 2020 to August 2023, which really meant she orchestrated the establishment of the sixth branch of the armed forces. And Jane Harman served 9 terms in Congress, was ranking member of the Intelligence Committee after 9/11, currently a member of the NASA DHS Advisory Council's recent chair of the Commission on the National Defense Strategy, and she urged me to tell you all that the best part of her bio is that she's the grandmother of 9. So thank you all very much. And Jane, let me start with you. I think we got a very good primer there on the strategic environment, but we hear a lot about why space is important: GPS, military communication, intelligence. Why should we understand that this moment in space and for space is so vital for the United States?
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you, CFR. I actually became a member of CFR in 1992, and the relevance of that is I was also elected to the U.S. Congress in 1992. I'm not sure which one was more significant, but 1992 was 1,000 years ago, and it relates to this conversation. I became a member of the Space Subcommittee in the Congress. I was elected to represent what was then called, and still may be called, the Aerospace Center of Los Angeles, where there was, still is, the Aerospace Corporation, which is an FFRDC, and what was then called the LA Air Force Base, now renamed, and Nina can tell you all about it. It has to do with Space Force. But the reason I'm telling this story from another century is that I thought, geez, this space stuff is really interesting and it matters. But 33 years later, the entire landscape has changed. I think the movie was great, Esther, congrats.
Yes, great job.
In telling a story of the space explosion. I don't mean just explosion in terms of space junk, but I mean the enormous growth of space, most of it since 2019. And just, a few little tidbits here. We have, I don't know how many times more the number of satellites. You just heard from the movie what China is doing. We have a chart that's going to come out in the report, which is not yet published in final form. But if you can see here, this is all the growth since 2019. And that's when Jane got elected to Congress. So it's pretty flat. Hurts my feelings, but it's pretty flat. But I do want to commend the Trump 1 administration for a lot of this growth in space. Did you know that Mike Pence, then the vice president, was the one who revived the Space Council? Did you know that the Artemis Accords, which are a major tool of U.S. Soft power, 53 countries belong to these things, and many more want to get in the door, were started in 2020, before Trump left office, and so forth. So I just want to make a point that I hope Trump, too, will continue to focus on this. And we make some recommendations in our report that I think matter a lot in terms of making space a priority in the United States and maintaining US leadership. I think we'll go into this further, and I've hogged a bunch of time. But one of the things we are urging is that the Trump II administration convene a space summit and declare space through our Department of Homeland Security a part of our critical infrastructure. We talk a lot about AI. Even Mike Froman's CFR talks a lot about AI. But I want to say how honored I was to co-chair this, and that CFR has talked about space policy as a major focus for this organization.
So Nina, before we get to the recommendations, I want you to go into a little bit more depth on the vulnerability of US assets in space. We heard a lot about space junk, but I want you to also engage with what Jane just mentioned, Chinese, Russian capacity, including anti-satellite capacity.
Absolutely. Thank you all for being here and those online as well. It was my honor to co-chair this task force with Congresswoman Harman and with Esther Brimmer's pen. This has been fantastic. CFR putting a fine point on space or a flashlight on the issues around the space domain, the challenges that we're facing is more important now than ever. What I see is a train wreck coming. We enjoy the benefits of space each and every day, mostly from that GPS timing signal. That timing signal runs so many critical aspects of our lives that without it, we could quite literally be lost. The American economy is booming because mostly American companies are just doing phenomenal things, cutting edge technologies, making access to space easier, and then putting commercial capabilities where only governments prevailed in the past. And so the promise of space for Americans and for the world is absolutely incredible, and it's only going to continue as long as the president and our nation declares space a national priority. What the vulnerabilities are, really it's this confluence of issues. Our reliance on space, but the threats from Russia and China and others. Russia and China for years have been studying US space capabilities, mostly in terms of how our militaries use space on the battlefield. Communications, position, navigation, and timing, weather predictions, missile warning satellite predictions. And those those capabilities have been the envy of Russia and China. So before they actually started using space for the benefits of their societies, they schemed ways on how to highlight the vulnerabilities for American space systems. They have come up with ground-based missiles or anti-satellite weapons, ASATs, that can launch into low Earth orbit, actually all the way up to geosynchronous Earth orbit. Geosynchronous Earth orbit is where we have our strategic eyes and ears, our missile warning, and our strategic communications satellites. They have ground-based lasers and dazzlers that can reach low Earth orbit and interrupt operations of our most sensitive systems, our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellites. They have space-based capabilities, space-based assets, such as robotic arms, and they're working on systems that can jam and blind and destroy our systems in all orbits. You compound all of this by the fact that there are more and more objects in space, as Jane showed you in that chart, more and more countries involved in space, more debris. And the cherry on the top of all this, no rules. There are no rules of the road in the space domain. There's no governance. And space policy needs to really tackle this problem from all aspects. And you'll see in our report, which I love because it's so digestible. You can read the executive summary and see, here's the situation, here's our findings, here's our recommendations. I'm very proud to have been part of this organization and this team. We had 20 amazing experts helping us write this report, and it's truly been a phenomenal experience.
And Esther, stay on the strategic environment before we go to the actual recommendations of the report, and jump on what Nina was saying at the end there. No rules, and to the point, no organization even capable of writing those rules, as we have this rise of not only Chinese and Russian assets, especially Chinese, but also the commercial rise.
Certainly. First, I'd like to say it has been an honor to be project director for this report. This is a team effort. We were led by our dynamic co-chairs. There is a team across the Council on Foreign Relations that worked with our experts on the task force who devoted their time and expertise, especially to say to Esther, Paige, whatever, fix that, make sure it's right. So I want to thank the people across this institution, across this community that supported this report. We know how important space is, and it's great to see this whole community in this room and beyond saying this is where we need to focus in order to have a coherent strategy. I think the key word here is policy, as the co-chairs have indicated, which suggests an integrated approach. I will comment in particular on this lack of governance. When we think about major domains in the world, we think about oceans, we think about airspace. When many of you flew here to get here today, you got on an aircraft, you get on an aircraft, you had to fly anywhere in the world, and the rules are governed by the International Civil Aviation Organization. The International Maritime Organization looks after some of the rules for shipping, that we have some agreements on managing and human operations in these spaces. It's very different in space, because at first, when we saw the iconic landing of US astronauts on the moon and planting the flag for all mankind, all humanity, you would say now, but we did not envision a world where you had important space companies, where you see this expansion of human activity. So in a sense, this is a classic question of international relations, is when you have more people in the space, but no one authority, what do? You need to set some rules. And so we're talking about rules of the road, which would work on communications, would work on how we actually interact with others. And so that's the underlying question. And then, as we say, that we then look at the fact that we will have to work with everybody in this area, including our adversaries. If you land in Beijing or you land in Dulles Airport in Washington, you're covered by the international rules about civil aviation. Similarly for space, we will have to work with the other spacefaring countries, which include good friends and adversaries. But we suggest that we have the right tools to do it, but we will have to work with what we have. If you were starting with a clean slate, you might create a new organization. That's not going to happen. We are unlikely. If you wanted to create a new organization, you need a treaty, you need to get that passed. That's not happening. But there are practical things we can do with the existing institutions that will make the situation better for human operations in space.
So if that's the strategic environment, for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll go through all the recommendations. I'll try and split it up into about 6 or 7 questions. And we might maybe mention a certain senior advisor to the president who happens to run a space company at the same time. But Jane, let's start with what you mentioned before. Number one recommendation in this report is to make space a priority. That's the phrase you used before, and you used a space summit. What is a space summit, and why is that the first most important recommendation in this report?
Well, if I just might start with that unmentioned person to tell one more story, which is that in the 90s, while I was in my early terms in Congress, I got a call from somebody in El Segundo, California. That is where the Aerospace Corporation is, and the now new named name of,
It hasn't changed yet, Jane.
no, it hasn't changed. The now old named LA Air Force Base is. And this person was in a rental facility with sawdust on the floor. I am not making this up. And I met this person, and there were these large rockets on the floor. And this person told me that he was using some Russian technology in these large rockets and thought he could make them much more inexpensively than some of the large primes who were then making rockets for the United States military. And could I help him get some contracts with DOD? Well, I'm not sure I was much help, but he sure moved along. And now we know who this unnamed person is. And his company, SpaceX, is outside my old congressional district. In fact, it's taken over the entire contour of what is called Hawthorne Airport, east of LAX, for those who haven't visited it. And it's an amazing state-of-the-art facility. And he has other facilities too, but just stunningly impressive what he has built. Okay, that's my shill for him. Space Summit. You've heard both from Nina and Esther about the growth of space, both as a military tool and a commercial tool. And there are many companies that play in this space. So what would a space summit be? For starters, it would be a showcase of where we are and where we're going. And I showed you the chart of this gigantic growth. But then it would be, one hopes, a showcase for continued US leadership. The movie talked about the Sputnik moment. Some of us were alive then, this grandmother of 9. They weren't alive, but I was in 1957, 57, 59.
57.
Come on, people. Mike, 57. Okay. I knew he would know the answer. When we were totally surprised. Well, this is another Sputnik moment. We could be totally surprised again by the advances in China and Russia. So what would a space summit do? It would marshal the tools that we have and demonstrate why US leadership is continuing and will continue. And let me just close with one thing I said before, Nick, which is, I think, and this is certainly amplified by my recent experience on the NASA Advisory Council, that space power is our best soft power tool. It is how the US showcases our support for the rest of the world. The Artemis Accords, which 53 nations belong to so far, are a way that developing countries all over the world, certainly in the global south, can develop their space programs and let their kids dream about futures for them and their countries. And I can't think of anything as important now at a time when we are sadly, in my view, defunding things like USAID and some of our development programs. I can't think of a thing that would be at least a worthy fly to flag, more important than our space leadership.
We do still use the phrase "reach for the stars," kid, after all. Nina, one of the next main recommendations that you make, and this is a little complicated, so I'm going to give you some time on deterrence. So how do we deter? But first, I think the main point that you make in the next recommendation is hardening. So how do we harden our own assets to make it more difficult for our adversaries to attack?
We do recommend, as part of this summit or very soon thereafter, to do a full national inventory of our current capabilities in space. Who's doing what? We have commercial companies, civil, military, and then even within military, it's not just the Space Force that has assets in space. And our intelligence community has several different agencies with assets in space. And so an inventory to understand basically what we're looking at. And then a vulnerability assessment of those capabilities. There are, no satellite on orbit has any protection at all. Period. No satellite has any protection. They are launched, they, are launched into their operational orbit. They go through a test period, they start operating, and there is nothing to stop some of those threatening capabilities I talked about with Russia and China. If Russia proceeds with what we've heard, them threaten to put a nuclear capability in space, the devastation would be enormous. There's no way to protect against a nuclear detonation in space except to nuclear harden every single item up there. And that is just untenable, that it would be very, very expensive and simply untenable. But even for some of these other threats I was talking about, there are no current defenses. So this capability gap needs to be analyzed. Defenses need to be put in place. We know the Space Force is already proliferating low Earth orbit to try to enhance the capabilities they have in other orbits. And that could serve as actually a deterrent as well. So vulnerability, capability gap assessment, and now to talk about how to deter. That could be another report. I would love for a volunteer we could write an entire report about how to deter in the space domain or using the space domain. But part of it is because deterrence is in the mind of the adversary. Hardening something, an adversary would think twice about attacking a hardened system. Proliferated systems, an adversary would think twice about how many shots he would have to take out that proliferated capability. Those are the kinds of things that are already in work across our government, but not funded to the right capability. So if the Trump administration declares space as a national priority and puts the resources behind that statement through the summit and through our vulnerability assessment, that's what this report recommends we do.
Esther, I wonder if you could explain how the report explains how a space needs to be treated as global commons. How do we best do that? And something that we've talked about, not only with SpaceX, but with other commercial companies. The report specifically says coordinate with commercial companies. How do we best do that?
Right, certainly. So I'll do a mini version of the lecture, right? So maybe the question is, how do we think about those areas that are beyond national jurisdiction? And there are multiple concepts here, but I would say the important thing first to note is that, of course, in our fundamental, foundational international treaty, the Outer Space Treaty has a long name, I'll call it the Outer Space Treaty, that it does talk about areas that are the common heritage of mankind. Say common heritage of humanity now that, and so that the idea is that there are areas to which we all have access, we would all be able to use, but none of us would own it. So if you look at the Outer Space Treaty, it both talks about these areas, it also talks about that no one country would have sovereignty over these areas. Now, how do we think about that? There is a larger concept of global commons. Not everyone uses that term. Officially, the United States doesn't use that term, but scholars do. And what we're trying to get at is this idea of spaces which, if overused, are then no longer usable for everybody. Irrespective of what term you want to go into, and lots of really great graduate theses and great books have been written on this point. But the fundamental point here is that for us in the United States, where we're always used to being the first one there, that some people might say that as long as we're first, we'll get to claim what we want to do. We may not always be first. So you might argue it's the right thing to do, or you might argue it's the practical thing to do. But I think we do need to open up to recognize that, okay, how do we think about how we want to operate in those areas beyond national jurisdiction where we may or may not be the first ones there? And so that that idea gives us some power there as well. And then you want to talk about the other issue, which was the question of how do we engage commercial entities in these governance issues. Typically, governance is an issue for national governments, and they send diplomats and experts who work on these topics. Interestingly enough, of course, is that space, as we've indicated, is being driven by a dynamic private sector. This we see in several areas. Colleagues who work on cybersecurity would say, yeah, we see dynamic areas that are changing governments. So in this case, we say that although we can't create a new organization, we could borrow ideas from other entities, other international organizations that might help us. So for example, the International Civil Aviation Organization, which handles air traffic, they have both a Air Navigation Commission, which is made up of experts nominated by national governments, but they serve as experts. Another model is to create a companion organization. Indeed, there's something called the International Air Traffic Association, IATA. It's actually headquartered in Montreal, same city where ICAO is. And it's actually a body of basically the airlines. Now, they've spent a lot of decades on fares, but back in the 1940s and early 50s, they worked on air safety issues. So there are some models because we know there's expertise in the private sector with a variety of non-governmental experts that need to be part of space governance. And we need to be creative in how we bring them in and bring that expertise into space governance.
Jane, you wanted to jump in,
I
but
just
also mention.
wanted to add something there. First of all, our all-woman group went to Europe to see the UN agencies in Vienna. Mike, sorry, we didn't invite you, Mike. But we also went to Brussels to meet with NATO. And space is a huge interest of NATO, think military, and of many countries in Europe. Even a little country like Monaco is so eager to join Artemis Accords and has set up a space agency of its own. So this is just very dynamic stuff. But the other point I wanted to make was that space doesn't respect national boundaries. Climate doesn't either. Terrorism doesn't either. And there's an overlap here, space as a tool to understand climate, and it is being used as that tool in many places. Space is a tool to find bad guys. And I guess girls have to admit, but just saying that there are parts of this, the fact that it is not yet regulated, that are opportunities. And at these UN agencies, last comment, the Russians and the Chinese were there. Which does not mean we should put the Chinese on the International Space Station tomorrow. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is we should use opportunities, especially in the dangers of space debris and so forth, to have a conversation with everyone about what to do, and just maybe some good relations in a limited sphere will break out. And the world will be a bit safer.
And that leads, Nina, to the next recommendation that we've talked about, China and Russia in the context of deterrence and hardening, but the report makes a specific point. Explain what sharpening policy on China means, and explain what creating the rules of the road with China and everyone else would mean.
Sharpening the policy on China is so important for our nation to be looking at. They, like it or not, they operate in space. And as you saw in the video, and as we know by facts, in the last 5 years, they've launched 500 satellites. They too are working on a mega constellation like Starlink. They too have ambitions in space, as you see with their own space station, their taikonauts. They have landed on the moon, not once, but twice on the far side of the moon. And there are reports that they are actively communicating from the moon. Of course, not manned right now, but those are definitely some of their ambitions. And so sharpening this policy to us meant somehow figuring out how to still have American leadership, but bring China to the table so that they can be part of the solution. So we recommended 2 very specific areas to look at. Number 1, space traffic management. Space traffic management is currently done by a unit in the United States Space Force. It's a military operation. And the way they communicate with China on a potential collision path that they identify, they communicate by email. And this email never gets answered. This email goes to, well, the other side of the world. And there's no set correspondence or communication. There's no hotline like we do have with Russia for operations, like we do have with Russia for nuclear, potential nuclear situations. We have nothing like that with China. So part of the sharpening is bring them to the table. There was another kind of hook we talked about. Because we are all becoming more spacefaring nations with humans in space, don't you think astronauts are going to be stranded more often than they currently are, potentially? There could be an emergency on the ISS that we need help with. There could be an emergency on the Chinese space station or on the moon. Wouldn't it be great to expand our current astronaut rescue plan to broaden it? Right today, Russia has and China have signed off on it, and it's discussing plucking astronauts out of the ocean or off the Earth's surface. But we need to expand it to now on orbit or other bodies, types of rescue missions. And so those are the kinds of things that this report explored to sharpen that policy.
And Esther, wrap us up on the recommendations. We've talked a lot about U.S. leadership, but Jane mentioned the U.S. Space Council. Why is that so important? And what would you recommend if you were inside the Trump administration on how to operationalize everything we've said in terms of U.S. leadership?
Our main message is that space needs to be a coherent, leading policy in the United States government. This is a major national priority. We need to organize in order to make it a priority. Therefore, we need to look at how the relationship between agencies and with the executive authority. So usually the National Security Council performs that role on the national security side. In this case, we also have the National Space Council, which could be the right vehicle. The administration will decide what the vehicle needs to be, but we think it is important that there is a coherent process for bringing together the assets and expertise across the federal government to work with the private sector and experts to make space a priority and make sure the United States continues to lead in space.
I would just add to that it was the Trump administration that revived the Space Council in the office of the vice president. And we're not saying it has to be there, but it should certainly be a function of the National Security Council to focus on space. So it should be somewhere there. And the Space Summit would nail the fact that the administration is committed to making space a priority.
We're almost out of time in terms of our section up here before we go to the members. We got one Elon Musk story so far. And I do want to ask Nina, and full disclosure, she knows this is coming. What should we understand about Elon Musk's role in what has been in terms of his role with SpaceX and how he operates?
The reason Nick is asking me is because I was the commander of the 45th Space Wing, which is at Patrick Space Force Base now in Cape Canaveral. Just prior to that, I was at Vandenberg Space Force Base. Both of my roles as wing commander were launching rockets for our nation. And SpaceX was on the move. I mean, they were really growing at the time, and they had huge ambitions, of course, for, making access to space cheaper and going to Mars. That is the vision. You walk into that Hawthorne headquarters, there's a huge picture and maybe even a banner of Mars. You walk into other companies and you look around for the mission and vision statements. That's all SpaceX needs. It's a picture of Mars. to motivate and focus their employees every day. So in working with SpaceX, and particularly Elon, we were at the time really trying to help with licenses and leasing, environmental inspections, safety concerns. Are you kidding me? They want to bring a rocket back to Cape Canaveral? Oh, that's impossible. But we worked through all of these issues, really leaning forward. At the time, it was the Air Force. And what we noticed in working with SpaceX, one anecdote within my story here, I had gone out to see the landing pad that they had taken a Space Launch Complex 13 and created through our help with leases and licensing and environmental, created landing pad number 1. And I went out to look at the pad, and they were boasting about the concrete and how flat it was, and maybe it's going to get in the world record books. And I said, wow, that's really cool. A couple weeks later, they had destroyed that pad because they realized they're going to land multiple boosters, not just one booster. They're going to land multiple boosters. And today they do land 2 at a time. And if you've never seen it, wow, it's absolutely stunning. So he moves fast. He really moves fast. He's got vision. He hires the smartest people, works them very hard, presses rules and regulations. And the outcomes are truly amazing.
And he's not afraid of failure, which is a huge part of innovation. And sadly, as this Commission on National Defense Strategy, which I recently chaired, said in a unanimous bipartisan report, our government has become risk averse. And what Elon Musk and SpaceX have shown is that this is how you make progress in this domain that is so crucial across everything.
So I hope that was a good introduction to the strategic environment, the report and its recommendations. This time we're going to turn it over to the members, both in the room and online. And we've got about half an hour, so we've got plenty of time for all questions. And a reminder, this is all on the record. So with that, we've got one question right in the middle. We'll go to her first, and then we'll move back around the room.
Thank you. Good morning. Hi, my name is Teresa Lowe, and I was up till recently the Senior Policy Advisor at the U.S. Mission to the United Nations for Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Esther, congratulations on another great report. I was proud to support you for the Arctic one, and it's a bit of a full circle moment for me here today. So congratulations again to you and to the Council and its team. My question pertains to the global governance aspect of this. As I'm sure you and the task force members know very, very well, in April and May of 2024, the UN Security Council, which is the only real body that supposedly has binding mechanisms, failed to adopt twice in a row a UN security resolution governing or attempting to govern the use of even weapons of mass destruction in outer space. And so given the importance of global governance and working multilaterally through a lot of these important challenges, to what extent do you believe that we're actually able to divorce some of the geopolitical competition and challenges and some of the very sticky conversations with Russia and China, and to be able to actually work together on governance in this space? And if you believe that there is actually a path forward in cooperating in this concrete area, how would you recommend that this administration approach that challenge? Thanks.
Yes, you want to take it?
Yes, first, Teresa, thank you for that question. And it's great to see you. She's one of our bright next generation of people who've worked here at CFR and are going on to be part of governance in the future. So great to see it. I see you across here, and I'll give a good shout out also for our term member program, which also supports the intellectual growth of the next generation will be part of solving these problems. So of course you've posed a challenging question. So I would say, let me just give a little background on the example that Teresa just shared with you, that if you read the report, you will see that we talk about about Russian action in 2021 involving anti-satellite missiles and our concern there that created a large amount of debris. The United States then took a leadership role and said, the United States will not use direct descent anti-satellite missiles and led an international effort in this area. Now, the first place, of course, to go for these sorts of issues is the Security Council.
We wouldn't test.
To test,
We would
to
not.
test. We not test. We would not test. We would not test. And you would go to the Security Council in order to try to bring out further countries adopting this approach of not testing anti-satellite missiles. That said, of course, that obviously Russia vetoed it. So then the effort moved to the General Assembly, where there is no veto. There was eventually a resolution passed, which of course does not have the same effect, but it raises this issue of where are you going to get that type of cooperation. I would suggest, as the report does, that we'd have to look at very focused, narrow situations, and it probably won't get resolved tomorrow. But the idea, as countries realize that they do need to cooperate in these narrow areas, that's where we can see that some ability to move forward. And that's why, in particular, if you look at things like rescue and return, that is one of our oldest principles is rescue. And there, if we need to expand a bit the ability to save each other, maybe that's where we can start. But you're right, this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be fast.
Let's stay in the room for the next one. Got a question up here. Yeah, and then we'll go online and we'll come back.
Yes, good morning. First of all, thanks to the panel. Excellent discussion, the task force for the report, and Stephen, thanks for the idea. That was, it's great, timely. My name is Tim Persons. I'm a partner with PricewaterhouseCoopers. I used to be the chief scientist at the GAO, and then prior to that, National Time and National Security. So I really wanted to ask about the space debris problem. Right, so I know that NASA not too long ago did a report on the economics of trying to clean up. And it just struck me when Nina and Jane were talking about like the Musk-like thinking. What does the task force think about the cleanup problem? Are there options there that are reasonable, economic, and could be coordinated under this new regime? Thank you very much.
Yeah, you want to take that?
Thank you for your question. We, a little bit of a story here. When we first gathered to go down the path of writing this report in the first place, we were talking about rules of the road in low Earth orbit. And then we, our very smart task force members, and we realized, why limit rules to one orbit? The threats are in all orbits. The orbital dynamics works in all orbits. So we needed to expand. And the reason I bring this up is debris is not only a problem in low Earth orbit, it is magnified in low Earth orbit. But it certainly could be a problem anywhere. In low Earth orbit, the Kessler effect is something that we bring up in our report, which is essentially debris creates debris until it ruins the very domain. And I'm not trying to be alarmist. I don't have the calculation of how bad this is or could be, because the other side of the coin is space is big, isn't it? Space is large. But there is a potential without rules of the road, without debris mitigation, without sitting down with all spacefaring nations and working out how to mitigate debris and how to manage the traffic. We could lose the very orbit that we enjoy today.
Question online, I think.
Thank you. We'll take our next question from Lindsay Howard.
Thank you, and thank you to this very distinguished panel. My question is about the ring of Chinese satellites around our ring of satellites and the defense implications. That's a very simple way to put it. But given that the Chinese and the Russians have been studying all of our maneuvers in electronic warfare, GPS, everything else, and now, especially the Chinese, have put a ring of satellites around our satellites, which theoretically could interrupt our own operations in battlefield conditions, what is our strategy and policy and your policy prescriptions moving forward, given the enormous cost of dealing with and competing with such a reality? Thank you.
Is that how you describe it?
Lindsay, I think I hear your concern writ large. I personally have not heard about it termed a ring of satellites around our ring of satellites, because every orbit is different, and it's very difficult to put a ring around something that's actually moving, but and very fast, by the way, 17,000 miles per hour in low Earth orbit. Not impossible, but my gosh, it would be extremely expensive for China to encompass every single object that we have in space. But your concern is very real. I definitely hear it, and our report recommends that these vulnerabilities be addressed and quickly, because they could be very detrimental to our military operations and our day-to-day life as Americans.
And if I could just add to that, hi, Lindsay, but add to it that, as was mentioned, certainly the possibility of a nuclear weapon in space is enormously concerning. But the right answer isn't just match the widget with the widget. The right answer is to think strategically, how do we deter the activity, prevent and deter? And it may not be a space-based answer. It may be a broader answer. And in that regard, the last questioner just gave a sort of subtle shout out to Steve Hadley, who's sitting right here. And I think it was his idea to have this study. So thank you, Steve. He also, among the others in the task force, was a major contributor, and he will be on the next panel. So a big thank you to you, Steve.
And Jane, to your point, when the Biden administration was hands forced and they had to go public with the nuclear weapon in space, because Turner, then the chair of the House Intelligence Committee, blurted it out basically very purposely in an email. The briefing, actually, I think at the Munich Security Conference last year they gave us, was essentially that they had no intention of countering this with their own version. It was very much threats or deterrents on how to prevent Russia from ever fielding it. So let's go back to the room. We'll come back up here, but I saw a hand way in the back first. So let's go back there. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gabby Moran, and I work on AI integration for the Navy. So thank you so much for the wonderful remarks so far. I have two really quick questions. And for the first one, I want to drill in on something that General Armaño said earlier about bringing the Chinese to the table. What would you say, as you said, we can get an email back when we have that Space Force task force reaching out? Do we need another round of Sunnylands? Do we need something modeled after the Navy's rules of engagement at sea? What formats do you think would work best? And then my second one was just a quick one. And forgive me, I haven't read the report yet, but is there a particular entity within the federal government that you think would be best suited to lead that audit of our capabilities? Could it be, a multitude of entities, or is there someone best suited? Thank you.
Actually, our report recommends the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, to lead certainly the inventory, and then it would be a collection of agencies, DoD, the intelligence community, NGA, NASA, to look at the vulnerability piece. Your first question about bringing China to the table and how would that work? How likely is that? My goodness, the thing we need is trust. And since that seems like a distant pipe dream, the next thing would be leverage. leverage comes in all forms. But I would hope that the leverage would be, look, we're all trying to use this domain for the benefit of our societies. It's crowded, it's getting dangerous. Let's come to the table and discuss how to internationally, and all of us agree on rules for space traffic management and rules for debris mitigation.
Well, search and rescue is an obvious area to pick. I mean, let's look at how not just in our country, but countries come together around natural disasters. And I would think both sides would have a huge potential political gain in trying to help with something like that, whether it's a Chinese or US problem or a problem of some other participant in space.
Esther, you want to?
Just to add to this, that this is also an area where other countries can take leadership. And on some issues that the United States cares about, the United States doesn't always have to actually be in the lead. And so that there are examples where you've had third parties, other countries that have played an important role. I mean, just a little tiny microcosm of this on our trip last year when we were in Vienna. We went to there was a sort of a special meeting just before the opening of the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. But what was interesting was it was discussing how to look at issues related to the moon. But the lead country that was actually going to lead the task force was actually Romania, because they had a good diplomatic team on the ground, and everybody was talking to them. And it was actually helpful that it was not one of the big powers. And so sometimes in some of these international settings, having another country take the lead, then everyone else can kind of come in, behind, can sometimes be a helpful.
And certainly that's a role that India is trying to play, and Prime Minister Modi will talk about space with President Trump during this week's visit. Next hand, I think I saw on this table. Yeah, right there. Thanks. Then we'll go to the back.
Me, right?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for hosting this. And it's wonderful to hear your insights. My name is Alice Zhang. I am a China analyst, formerly was INDOPACOM. And right now I'm finishing my doctorate at SAIS, Johns Hopkins. And so my question is kind of a follow-up to Gabby was talking about earlier on US-China and how to get China more engaged in having conversations and building hotlines, for example. And it's been challenging, as we all know, that to get China more open to have hotlines with our military, to just have more engagement at large. And without this rule, universal rule or world rule, potentially China can actually leverage and to develop further. And without our coherent national priority or leadership, other countries, not just China, can actually take advantage of the opportunity. So my question is, how do we collaborate? What advice, specific advice that you would give on starting a hotline or, developing collaborations for climate or terrorism that, for issues that was no boundary on this type of, or starting some kind of organization to facilitate and to foster collaborations that will actually benefit humanity. Thank you.
Our report doesn't dive into the details that you're talking about here. It actually sounds like something you could help us with, help our nation with. We lay out ideas, but we don't prescribe exactly how to do it.
But when President Biden and Xi Jinping met in San Francisco, I think it was last year or the year before, one of the pieces of conversation was how to reestablish a mill-to-mill communication, military-to-military communication, because there is a huge danger of miscalculation, which everybody in this room fully and listening in fully understands. And this should be, in my view, a part of that. At first, it did not restart. Then the last time I asked, it does exist again. And building into that should be the pieces of this that are low-hanging fruit. I mean, like search and rescue and other things that have a common theme where everybody looks good and it's not a zero-sum game. And I think that certainly the task force supports that. And I think that idea, if there is a space summit and if there is a revived Space Council, could be a huge priority.
Absolutely.
Esther, anything to? Yeah. All right, another question toward the back there against the door. Thank you.
Thank you. Victoria Sampson, Skill World Foundation. I'm sorry, another China question. But I was really excited to hear you guys talking about the need to sharpen our relationship there, because that's something my organization has long argued for, that there's a need to coordinate with China. Like among them, they're in space, they're going to be on the moon with us. We need to be able to do something to be able to consult with them and coordinate issues. But one of the things that I've argued is a speed bump to that is the Wolf Amendment, in terms of it sends a signal that China is not to be trusted. And if I were China, I'd be like, I'm not going to do anything with you guys. You guys have a whole legislative thing, banning, putting speed bumps to working with China. So I'm curious to know if your task force has an opinion or talks about that in your report about what to do if we're going to maintain the Wolf Amendment, keep it, ignore it, lessen it, or something along those lines. Thank you.
You're smiling, so.
And we're looking at you.
So first, thank you for the question and thank you for the work that you've done in this space for a long time. You know, and there are many people in this room who've been part of, I say, DPR knowledge on these areas. I'll just take us a quick note, and in the presence of the congressman who will correct me, that because I'm going to talk about a position, in addition to the annual appropriations for NASA that many of you are familiar with, which was what's called the Wolf Amendment, named for Congressman Wolf, who was particularly interested in human rights and China issues, but has an opportunity to make the case via having a measure within the annual appropriations that does not allow NASA nor the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy to interact with their counterparts without actually notifying both Congress and now the FBI. So it's a provision. So they can interact, but there is a process they have to go through. And one of the questions is that actually inhibiting the ability for these certain parts of the civilian agencies to speak? Or is that just symbolic? You know, is it that it gives China basically, political ammunition to say, the United States doesn't want to talk? I won't take other legal issues, but we're saying we think that you can work around that, around that issue, and that's actually solid.
I served with Frank Wolf, who was is principled man and who was responsible for numbers of pieces of legislation around topics like this. We gently suggest not repealing the Wolf Amendment, but kind of nudging it a little bit to make it fit this modern problem. And I don't know what Frank Wolf thinks of this, but I would like to think that if we had a conversation with him, he would say, yeah, I mean, why would we not want China in the room when we're dealing certainly with non-military, commercial and human catastrophes in space?
I like that, nudging, definitely a legal term. Mike.
Thanks very much. And again, terrific panel. I want to go back to the issue of deterrence, Nina, because you really focused on deterrence by denial, hardening our assets, things of that sort. But there's also a role potentially for deterrence through punishment. And maybe as a former general in Space Force, you'd like to share with us what our offensive capabilities are in space, or what, maybe more generally, what role you see for offensive capabilities, maybe not tit for tat, nuclear weapon to nuclear weapon, but is there a role for us to play in establishing deterrence by punishment, either in the space domain or in an asymmetric way?
Michael, I don't know if you're trying to get me put in jail or not.
And also distinguish, what has been communicated publicly, right? That's one question, but also privately.
Oh. Hey, I'm a lawyer. I'll defend you.
There you go.
I can neither confirm nor deny. No, currently we have the United States has no weapons in space, has no offensive capabilities in space. I'm retired, from the United States Space Force. Is our nation working on it? Sure. But currently they don't exist. And so it was actually Secretary Austin that talked about integrated deterrence, which tells us that we can deter a negative situation happening in the space domain via another domain. And we can use all levers of power, diplomatic, information, military, economic, in many types of ways to impose punishment. So that's, in the future, will there be some kind of capability that the US has where we can hold a valuable asset of another country in space at risk? Potentially, but today, since we don't, we need to have an integrated deterrence approach, and we do.
Time for a couple more questions, I think. Let me just scan the room quickly. All right, so let's do right in front here, and then we'll go in a kind of circle to try and get everyone. Right in front, yeah, thanks.
Hi, I'm Lauren Williams. Thank you very much for this panel and for CFR's focus on this issue. Certainly agree, along with everyone else, I'm sure, in the room, that it's incredibly important now and going forward. I spent several years in the White House leading our efforts on cybersecurity and space issues. And then before that was in the Department of Defense working on space policy as well. And so I'm especially interested in the first recommendation, which is around, or the final point of the first recommendation, which is around declaring space systems a critical infrastructure sector, which I'm sure, as you all are aware, was a big subject of policy debate in the previous administration. And as a cyber person, was very much an advocate for it because, as you know, there are not rules of the road in pretty much any area of space policy. When it comes to cyber policy, there are lots of fragmented policies, standards, requirements. We have now, as a result of a recent executive order, new requirements, but there's still a lot of work to do. So I'm curious your thoughts on how the Trump administration, per your recommendation, would go about implementing or declaring officially space systems as a critical infrastructure sector. Thank you.
Or Nina, you want to take it quickly?
Well, before we answer this, I want to ask you, those new requirements that you just mentioned, do you think they're adding layers of bureaucracy, or do you think they're inhibiting cyber operations, either commercial sector, private sector, government sector?
Thank you for the opportunity. They're very recently released in January of 2016. So one of the things that I was thinking about during this discussion, including around deterrence, is that many Space Force and Space Command leaders have noted that cybersecurity is the kind of soft underbelly of some of the counter space threats that are out there, and it's actually the most commonly used attack vector for our adversaries, particularly China and Russia. So the purpose of those requirements was really to distill down from you can read them, there are thousands and thousands of pages of requirements across the US government into maybe 5 to 6 core requirements that the US government, and you can extrapolate toward the private sector, need to implement to raise our common level of cybersecurity. So that was the intent of them, to distill down from the fragmented landscape that we have and say, you got to do these 5 things or else we're vulnerable.
Yeah, all right. Well, I was in Congress when the Department of Homeland Security was stood up and strongly supported it, as not that it was a perfect concept, just like perfection should not be the enemy of the perfect should not be the enemy of the good in government. Let's just hope we retain the good in government. But at any rate, the cyber capacity, CISA, that agency was established later. And I don't think it's that hard politically, if there's political will, to declare space a part of our critical infrastructure. The hard part is, what does it mean? And are we really serious about it? And we're all sitting up here saying we need to be really serious about the critical threats to and opportunities for space.
And consistent with our overall recommendations, we would like to see industry, commercial industry, brought into the discussion.
Good point.
This time.
Good.
Let's try and get one more question in. Yeah, right in the middle there. Sorry for not getting to all of the questions.
Brief. Jennifer Warren, and I lead Global Regulatory Affairs at Lockheed Martin. So I'd like to build on your comments about the lack of global governance and institutions that can do that. In the global context, there's the International Telecommunications Union, which does aggressively manage RF spectrum, which, as we all know, satellites, commercial or otherwise, military, are spectrum dependent. There's an effort to destabilize satellite systems by taking spectrum away. So that's where existing regulation is good. How do we prevent the destabilization of not just US, but NATO and other allied satellite capabilities by losing spectrum for space-based capabilities? Thank you.
Quick answers. Who wants to, Esther, you want to start?
I'll quickly say a little bit on ITU, but then just say that indeed, yes, and there's a lot of discussion of the International Telecommunications Union in the report. And to say that this is, so we talk about different pillars, and we talk about one of the pillars is ITU. We talk about the important role it plays.
Instead of lawfare, it sounds like spectrum fair, right? It just reminds me of that. And yeah, our report does look at all the various institutions and respectfully looks at the ITU. But what you're talking about is, I guess, statecraft almost by other countries coming in to try to destabilize spectrum. And again, another reason that we all need to get on the same page. I mean, really, we ignore space as a priority at our own peril in this country.
Right. Well, that is a fitting way to end. Thank you for joining the meeting. Thank you, Nina, Esther, and Jane. Thank you so much.